Hi, I'm John Paul, and a really warm welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm really pleased to be talking about the subject of men. I've recorded a video before about men called, I think I may have changed the title, but it was about men in terms of overdrive. So that would be where the part that's about, say, competition or winning, status, material wealth, that kind of thing, dominates, and the difficulties that that can have in terms of relationship with self and others, and also perhaps in therapeutic relationships. So I'll put a link to that video up here. But the focus today is going to be again about men, but in this case, looking at anger, men and anger. And I suppose from my point of view, looking at the different parts of people, anger would be more that part that's associated with protection, survival, and anger being a great asset as far as if we're taking the messages from it, as far as what we like, don't like, how we might want things to go ahead in the future. But if it's not sort of under conscious management, I suppose, I think it could potentially be kind of catastrophic in terms of people's psychological or men's psychological health and even physical. So I think it's a really important subject. Just moving on as well to look at empathy too. It's a subject that I like to talk about generally. Very important, I think, in terms of anger as well, in that I suppose one of the difficulties when we're angry or in a place of chronic anger is we probably will lack empathy for other people. So looking at it from that point of view, and also moving on a bit, hopefully, to incorporate something around intimacy as well. Perhaps, what that means, the difficulties, the obstacles that men may have in relation to intimacy, but also how important it is in terms of relationships to have that present in life. So hopefully covering lots of those subjects today. I'm absolutely delighted to have on with me to have that conversation James Hawes, who's a therapist.
Hi, John Paul. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. You've had a lot of experience. I mean, I can see your book, actually, The Secret Lives of Men, strategically positioned there. You have so much experience in working with men. So I think it's going to be great to have this discussion with you. Perhaps to start off, you could just give us a bit of background in terms of your career and some context as far as how you set things up now, and particularly working with men as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. So yes, I've been practicing as a counselor and psychotherapist for the last 20 years. And that's been my specialism has really been working with men, boys and men. So I've spent a lot of time working in schools as a school counsellor, with boys from all sorts of different backgrounds, and the same with men in terms of individually and in groups. So many years ago, probably about 12 years ago, I set up a little community company called Men at Work. And we started to explore three things within that company. One was anger. So we set up a group called Shout, a 10-week group to help men become more anger aware. I think we were going, and that was a very successful group, run over about 8 years. From again, men from all walks of community. We had men who were university professors sitting next to men who were struggling with homelessness or addiction, and that we were all there to work with anger. And that was a very useful, brilliant kind of practical group. A lot of it was working out through physicality. Yes, of course, there was psychoeducational input, but a lot of it was, right, we're going to get into this physically and trying to work that out. And the other project we set up was men's groups, which I've been part of a men's group for the last 20 years, and it's been a really important part of my development and kind of being held by other men in terms of emotionally and physically sometimes. And the third part of that work was we set up a group called Contact, specifically to work with boys kind of transitioning in puberty. So kind of classic rites of passage, if you like. And we got funding for these projects in inner city schools in Nottingham, which is where I'm based. And so we got some really interesting experience and tried out some really useful ways of helping boys kind of ultimately develop emotional fitness. And since then, so I do a lot of training. I train other therapists in terms of working with men and around anger. I work privately. I've got my private practice, and again, 95% of my clients are male, although I do work with women and I do work with couples. And as you alluded to, I've fairly recently written this book, The Secret Lives of Men, which is really a book to, from a lot of my experience of working with men, and it's there to help men and women to understand men, and also a big part of that is about how we as men can develop emotional fitness.
Okay. So specific that concept of emotional fitness, it focuses on, does it?
Yeah, there's like 10 keys. Okay, what do we need to kind of be conscious of, be aware of in terms of being able to grow? And I'm really interested, I suppose, in growing and how we develop from, this position to another position. And I think there's been I think a difficulty often in areas of masculinity, almost like it's a real struggle to kind of want to change. Whenever I've noted in terms of perhaps growth in the women's movement, or women being able to have more rights in certain areas, there's appeared to be a kind of backlash from men, almost like, well, hold on, they're taking something from us.
Mhm.
So there's something about power there, I think, and what I've noticed, I suppose, is that um, I think a lot of men, again, I'm not saying that men are not wanting to see women develop or have more rights, as it were, but there seems to be a sense of, but now I'm kind of using that word, which is I think is really interesting, emasculated, almost
Sure.
like there's something's been diminished around me, rather than
Sure.
seeing,
Mm.
well, can we grow? Can we evolve? Can we change?
Mm. Well, I suppose going back to the what I was saying at the beginning, actually, I think that place of fear, anger as well, they are it's the threat place, isn't it? To feel threatened by something, and I guess
Mm.
in order for somebody else to have something more, maybe that would perceive. That I would lose something. Also, that place of competition, which I think men can often, and women too, but it can often be encouraged to be dominated in men. So I suppose both of those places, I think, would see as somebody losing something,
Yeah.
possibly for somebody else to gain, but also to see something as threatening. I suppose some of the movements as well have criticised men too. So there is literally the challenge coming, isn't there? Which I guess some will respond to with feeling threatened and therefore potentially with anger. But I guess
Yeah.
going back to anger and focusing on anger specifically, it's something that's often been around, obviously, in your work. Amazing range of work that you've done. I mean, could you say a bit about it? What you believe about it?
Yes, of course. So, I suppose men present with anger a lot in my practice,
Mhm.
and anger that has kind of, well, what do we do? We could call it unhealthy, or they've lost control in some way, or
Sure.
it's now a crisis where it's kind of maybe damaging their life, their relationships in some way. So that's often where we start from with anger. And so what I'm trying to do, I suppose, is with anger at that moment is, yes, let's look at what is kind of triggering that. What is why are we moving into anger perhaps so readily? And I suppose part of my work, I would say that I tend to think that for many men, anger is their default emotion.
Mhm.
And we can look at that because if we look at, the construction of masculinity, many boys have learnt that actually, big boys don't cry, or you need to be strong, you need to be tough. So we're kind of diminishing the more vulnerable, tender emotions, as
Mhm.
in we can't access that anymore. And so we've got just anger, to either for anger to seep out or to explode out.
Mhm.
So that's why I think it's become often a default emotion. And I'm not around here when I work with anger, I'm not about blaming men for this. I think this is how what we've been given by society, and maybe it's been modeled to us. Um, but I think that information that I give men about what I've just said, and maybe seeing that as a default, that's our go-to, is really useful information straight away.
Sure.
The other way I look at anger is, and I think you alluded to this in your introduction, the idea of around survival, but the sense of that I see it as our emotional defense system. So
Mm-hmm.
classically, if we are physically under threat, we'll go into that fight, flight, freeze, appease situation automatically. Now, I think in terms of when many men feel threatened with maybe difficult or uncomfortable, vulnerable emotions,
Mm-hmm.
difficult situations that we don't know how to cope with, we go back and we touch into this emotional defense system. So it's basically saying, I need to protect myself. I'm
Mm-hmm.
under threat emotionally. And the best way, or maybe the only way I've got to look after myself here is anger. And
Yeah.
that might be a seeping out, more of a passive aggressive approach, or it might be an aggressive approach, and be that verbally or physically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm aware that I haven't. I know also you talked about the positive effects of anger. So for me, I think this is a really important aspect that is almost about how do we not, and this isn't just about men, I think this is about society. How do we get to connect with anger as an absolutely essential, healthy emotion? What are the benefits of when
Mm.
we are able to tap into anger in a healthy way? And I do think us as a society, um, we need to do some work on that. And I
Mm.
think this is true for men and women. That often we don't we fear, a lot of us fear anger, we fear conflict, and
Yeah.
for good reasons, because we've seen a lot of negativity or a lot of damage done through that kind of anger or unhealthy anger expression. But when I
Mm.
talk about anger as an emotion, I think, look, anger at its base is passion, is
Mm.
a motivator. It helps us to individuate, to be who we are.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't have touch with anger, then we miss these benefits of ability to move, to be direct, to be concise, to be able to tap into parts of our physical energy and our emotional energy. So,
Sure.
when we're able to access anger in a way even quicker, I think we can be able to be more authentic. We can create better relationships, more intimate relationships ultimately.
Mm-hmm. When you say quicker, what did you mean by that? Access anger quicker?
Well, yes, what did I mean? So because I think often what happens around that kind of the big emotion is that we may be conscious of an anger. We may be
Mm.
conscious that we're frustrated, we're irritated, or we're really absolutely, our boundaries have been broken. And but then some will go straight away, kind of
Yeah.
react straight away. Many of us, though, will kind of suck it up.
Mm-hmm.
And then we lose control almost of that energy, and it might morph into another emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And it may then move into an unhealthy expression of anger. It may be absorbed into our body, or it may be dumped or projected onto other people. So when
Yeah.
we're able to access, and I think this is true for any emotion,
Sure.
quicker, we have a better chance of being able to move that and be able to do it, I think, in a healthier way.
Mm. And it's that awareness around it, isn't it? I mean, I don't think in terms of other emotions, sadness, love, anybody would ever have said to me, I'm not a loving person, I'm not a sad, but the number of times that perhaps people would have said, I'm not an angry person, I'm not an angry person. People don't want to be known as an angry person, do they? And I can understand why anger gets that bad press in terms of
Mm,
what it can do when it's acted in, I suppose,
mm,
perhaps in terms of suicidal ideation, depression, that kind of thing, or certainly acted out as well at
mm.
others. It's a very significant disconnector, isn't it? If we're
Yes,
fearful, if we're frightened, people might come towards that a bit more. If we're
that's right.
angry, people have their mirror neurons, they're likely to get angry. It takes somebody to consciously, I think, de-escalate a situation if we're angry. So I can see why people feel that. But I think the trouble with, as you've said, with denying any emotion or disconnecting from it is that we don't have control over it. We're not going to be able to manage it and therefore express it in a healthy and helpful way. I think anger and helpful probably don't go together in most of our minds, do we? Because perhaps we've grown up in environments where we haven't been shown how to do that. And therefore, for us, anger has been problematic.
Absolutely. And I mean, when you said that, I immediately went to some of the couples I work with where, you know, you're going to classically doing the assessment and they will say, well, we don't get angry. Get angry with one another. And one of my questions really is, well, why not? Because if we're not getting a kind of angry or individuating, sharing our truth, which again comes from anger, then how do you know the other person? And the other thing I think, which we easily put anger into this box of this kind of dangerous, aggressive, violent emotion, and we miss, of course, in relationships and in ourselves, the anger that seeps out, which I think actually is as more dangerous, I think, often in relationships. So the passive aggressive, the irritation, the agitation, and the mood, silence, you know, the unspoken expectations, for me, that's the anger seeping out. And that is really difficult to manage and to deal with. But most of us, we just don't see that as anger. Where I think it's one of the key angers.
Yeah, definitely. That, as you say, silence, passive aggression. I remember somebody saying as well about oppositional behavior. So doing the opposite thing, knowing or getting home late or deliberately doing things, you know, acting it out behaviorally. The difficulty is nothing's communicated. It's not clearly communicated. The person on the receiving end doesn't know whether it's about that or something else, or they're just frustrated and annoyed. So it's ways in which anger could be communicated, which is not going to get our need met, is it? It's just going to make somebody else a bit annoyed or frustrated with us or confused. So that sort of healthy expression of anger, which perhaps we can come on to. I just wanted to say something because you mentioned working with couples, actually. And also we've talked about anger in terms of it being kind of defensive, possibly. I think unfairness and hurt as well, anger can come in as a secondary emotion, can't it? But if somebody's feeling fearful or threatened, I do remember listening to some training on somebody who was working with men, and they said that they were working with a couple, and the couple came in and they were very distressed, and the woman said, the man said she was criticizing me all morning, and I was very frustrated. I didn't say, I kept a lid on it, and then as she went out to her car, I went over to her car, I spat on her windscreen, and I called her a bitch. And the therapist said, I think you need to know the difference between defending yourself and attacking someone. And I just thought, that's such an interesting idea, isn't it? That in his mind, I mean, maybe he, who knows the operation of his mind, but in his mind, he was defending something potentially. But of course, that's the difficulty with anger, isn't it? It can often, because perhaps it's physical too and needs a physical expression at times, it can absolutely be an attack when somebody believes they're a victim, actually, in a situation, or somehow being done to.
Yes, and I think in that sense, that's where that kind of the default or the emotional defense system, I think, resides. And for me, it's like, well, if we don't become or work on emotional fitness, i.e., being able to access more emotions, then we won't, that's all we've got. We're going to defend or attack. And it's a kind of black and white situation rather than, can I speak about, can I be conscious of these other feelings that, you know, if I'm attacked, you know, I'm going to feel, well, hurt or, you know, disappointed or missed or some other feelings. And can I speak from that position rather than allow it to move into our default?
Yeah. And I think the thing, I suppose, perhaps moving into that territory now in terms of this conversation and ways to work with anger. You said you have worked with it in the past. I think you mentioned kind of physicality, working with the body and that kind of thing. Could you say a bit about that then generally, and perhaps also the idea of emotional fitness and connecting with other emotions as well?
Yes, absolutely. No, I think the first thing I have found to be really useful in working with men in over all these years is psychoeducation, actually.
Hmm.
You know, it's almost like, given the language that I've just used, in terms of default defense, that is really kind of almost waking up men. Thinking, oh, I didn't know. And one of the other things in this psychoeducational is to look at the different modes, I think, of anger expression. So I often break the anger world down into kind of 4 or 5 expressions. That might be passive anger. That is, I think, I use as attacking ourselves, turning inwards. You know, I'm rubbish. I'm bad. Yeah, and of course that's not healthy. Or the opposite to that is aggressive. We're blaming the other. They're the problem. You're making me angry, that kind of stuff. Then, as we've talked about, the passive aggressive, which I think is more subtle, hidden anger, unspoken anger, coming out in body or in words or in silence. And then there's rage, which I think rage is has much to do with the past and very little to do with the present. And again, all of these 4 types of anger, I would say, absolutely has a healthy element in them. You know,
Hmm.
that we could explore. Probably haven't got time to explore that today. And the fifth one, I think, you know, which a lot of us learn and talk about, are kind of assertiveness in terms of maybe how to speak our anger out in a way that is not going to hurt the other, but equally is not going
Yeah.
to hurt ourselves. So
Mm.
for me, that psychoeducational is absolutely part of that. Now, the second part of that is emotional fitness. So if we're going to work on our anger effectively, we do need to get a bigger access to more emotions. So my little 5-step emotional fitness program is really about, again, it's education, but I call it, it's like going to an emotional gym. You're going to have to do some work on this. You're
Mm.
going to have to learn a lot closer how to become aware of all of our emotions in that the last 5 minutes, the last hour, the last 2 hours. So we're on top. We're not absorbing, we're not holding on to, because I hear so many stories where people might have been work for 8 hours. They might have just not been conscious of any of their
Sure.
feelings or anger. They come back home, they dump it on their wife, their children, or their pets. And
Hmm.
for me, they haven't processed, they haven't worked at their emotions. So emotional fitness is really important. Now, in
Hmm.
terms of physicality, lots of the work in the groups that we did was around, I suppose, partly about helping men to get closer physically to one another. So a lot of the work we did was around, you could say, games. But you could say
Mm.
just learning about each other's anger and expression of anger, to say that, oh, we're learning in a physical game. It might have been a game that moved into actually even holding each other
Hmm.
in those spaces. We may do resistance work. So
Yeah.
that might be 2 men pushing each other and holding each other, being able to hold that strength and work with that resistance, and looking after each other, even though they may have a lot of this anger energy flowing through their body. We
Hmm.
have also, and I've done this in groups and individually, kind of the classic kind of cathartic work of using kind of bat and a pillow, um,
Yes.
where it's a controlled environment, a therapeutic environment, where they're kind of hitting a big pillow for about 30 seconds to a minute. And it's incredible what comes up there. You might not be feeling angry as you do it, but then you can access the anger. So that is a really useful piece of work done under controlled circumstances as
Mm.
well.
So
So there's some ideas.
you would facilitate that group, would you? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And how do you find it being around when there is that expression of anger? I mean, you have your own mirror neurons, your own amygdala, don't you? What's that like for you?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when people talk about anger. Now, over the last 20 years, working in groups and individually, I would say that there's been 2 times in 20, and I must have done thousands of sessions individually and many, many group sessions. There's been two times where I've felt threatened by men in angry, one in the group and one individually.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for the rest of the time, if I'm working with anger in those controlled environments, I feel I'm conscious of the people, men are accessing an emotion that could they could touch into something that is really uncontrollable for them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
absolutely, I'm going to be, before doing any of this physical work, we are going to obviously look at ground rules. We're going to look at ways for men to make sure they can look after themselves and make sure what they may need if they feel that they are losing control. And for me, in terms of if anger is emoted, and as it is, and I've had this personally towards me, maybe in some of the work I've done in men's groups, where it may be passive or it may be more aggressive, men being angry with me. I feel I've developed some of my work myself in terms of I I feel enlivened, I think, by it. I feel because I think, and this is some of the um, I think what some of the reasons why um, anger is really important is that it's something about really making contact. I want you to see me, and I
Mm-hmm.
want to be seen. I want to know that I matter, and I want some attention.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think this is really interesting when we go to physicality or even violence. That for me is the end game of I'm going to get some attention from you. I need something. And the physicality because we're right in that moment. So that that kind of energy can be, we're almost on the edge if it's not in a kind of controlled environment. And of course, us as facilitators or therapists, we have to do our work. And this is one of the things that I always say in some of my training with therapists is, well, some people don't work with anger because
Sure.
we may have had frightening episodes of that in our own childhood.
Mm.
So we need to be looking after ourselves in that.
Yeah, I said when some people are not working with, I guess they wouldn't specifically work with anger, but I think generally it is going to come up to some degree in all human beings because we do all have that fight or flight, well, or freeze or whatever. It's going to be there in some form, isn't it? Frustration, annoyance,
Yeah.
all kinds of ways that people might do it. It just looks different, feels different from people. But I think it's very common, isn't it, for people to have a disconnected relationship. I imagine what might happen in some ways with therapists is we would avoid people's anger, not even necessarily consciously, just because of how things are in the therapy room. We're not deliberately provocative often. I remember somebody saying that in order to, this is probably not true, it's probably an urban myth, but somebody said that they heard that somebody threw a cushion at their client in order to provoke their anger. Again, for our purposes though, whether that's true or not, I doubt it. But when you have the men come in to do these groups, do you actively put them, well, not you put them into their anger, but you ask them to connect with it, or just generally the fact that they're in the group, perhaps because groups often will make people feel a bit threatened, and perhaps therefore their response would be to be annoyed or frustrated. Do you deliberately try and bring it forward in men?
Well, it's interesting, John Paul, because when I do these groups, this is why I don't think anger gets so much out of control. Although I'm wanting to try and create, if we can get with the anger in the room, and it does happen. Certainly, some of the role plays I've done before, and it happens, and it's like, okay, now we can work with this in the moment, which I think is a great learning. When we're bringing that in, okay, I'm right here. How do I deal with this? But what I've found is because of the work that we're doing in emotional fitness, and it's as I say, it's a very active group. I kind of create this kind of feeling grid, physical feeling grid, where we might just have a breakout, after an exercise. Right, let's go to the feeling grid, which is a kind of emotion that's going to stand on how do you feel right now. So that's part of the emotional fitness training. and we're trying to exercise that emotion in that moment. And so what I have found is that when we create a safe environment, when we, then, there's not, you're the problem, mate, with the anger, but we're
Sure.
saying we're all dealing with anger here, and we're not, nobody, there's no blame, there's no judgment, there's no having to go. We've created this safe, warm environment. So what we experience is men being more vulnerable,
Mm,
talking about lots of their feelings, and there's lots of the background of why they may feel so angry.
yeah.
That there may be tears, there may be, and there's a lot of men learning and are, I think, empathic. They're looking after each other, they're looking out for each other, and this
Mm,
is just happens within, the sessions were 2 hours. You can see this happening after about 2 to 4 hours.
amazing.
Yeah,
Mm,
and so when people say, oh, men don't talk or men can't, I know that that's absolutely nonsense. They
sure.
absolutely can. When they're given
Mm.
the right environment, they can absolutely do this work.
Yeah. So in some ways, creating that environment, facilitating that environment means it's much less likely, they're much less likely to get angry. So what they have much more space to experience these other emotions. And of course, you are directing them in that way to talk to name the other emotions. You said practically you would use the feeling grid and they might stand on a
Yeah.
particular emotion. And yeah, so again, it's more language as well about other feelings, isn't it? Being able to express, be aware of their own capacity to experience other emotions, but communicating it to others in a group as well, which is all very helpful, I think, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And I think this work around feelings, and why I'm really interested in kind of emotional fitness, is that, if you tend to ask men, how do you feel? They'll kind of give you 5 or 6 words. Okay, not bad, fine, all right, normal. And that's
Mm-hmm.
all within what I would say that the kind of happy group part of the grid. And
Mm-hmm.
you'll get men, even when we're doing this grid, going to the happy grid. It's like, I'm always all right. I'm
Sure.
always, and but you're here, you're in the anger group. So,
Mm.
and there's lots of emotions stirred up here, but so we're trying to help them to move to these other parts of the grid by just pushing them a little bit and saying, is this really what you are? Or is this what you've learned to be? I need to be okay. I need to be sorted. Because I think it's quite a vulnerable thing to say, I'm not okay, or
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think also needing to be okay, if you're looking at those roles of protection, providing, we do need to be okay, don't we? In vulnerability, if we're protecting something, is a problem.
Mhm.
So those perhaps traditional roles to show vulnerability or weakness, not that I would use that word, that is problematic. And I guess also for providing vulnerability, I'm not okay, is not going to help there either. They're much vulnerability, intimacy, empathy, I think, are much more the territory of kind of connection, love, fondness, friendship, aren't they? But just perhaps, I mean, it'd be great to move on to kind of empathy and intimacy. You've
Yeah.
touched on it already and talked about it. But I just wanted to mention something that you said earlier as well about rage, actually, and about that being something from the past. Could you
Yeah.
just say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think when rage for me, when and I get a lot of men who will come individually to my practice, who, what is they don't come when they've got passive aggressive anger. It's generally rage. So this rage is generally an explosive, kind of emotion from
Mm,
0 to 100 in a matter of a nanosecond. Um,
mm,
and for me, so obviously some of the work there is looking at the triggers. What was it? And generally, it's always about being patronized, being less than. You're not enough.
mm,
And oft more than, I would say, 99% of rage that I work with is towards our intimates, classically the female at home.
mm,
So when I say rage is often, it's not about the present, but it's about the past. I think what happens there is the little boy is really present, and he is feeling that he is being diminished in some way. And
mm.
when he fits, so this is kind of that vulnerability, when he goes into that small place, and I think there's a real connection here. What we're talking about really is a kind of shame response. So I'm feeling quite small. And when we feel small, what do we need to go? We need to go big. So we go
Mm.
from smallness to big. Look how big I am. Look how powerful I am. You know, you don't know what you're dealing with here. So that rage has got that kind of emotional response feels totally out of proportion to
Sure.
what just happened in that moment. So
Mm.
that's kind of why I say, has that really got anything to do with that? Because that rationally, we as men and women would think that's just a little bit over the top, isn't it? And that's
Mm.
why I think there's a lot of information from the past in that moment. Now, can I just say something about rage in terms of being a healthy situation? Because I think
Mm.
rage is an instinctual survival mechanism is really important. So we hear these stories, don't we, that when people are physically kind of attacked or their loved ones, you know, we hear stories about people suddenly having this kind of power to lift up a car to release their child under. And I think that's something about rage gives us that kind of physical kind of power and ability that, you
Sure.
know, that actually I need to survive. I need my loved ones to survive. I find it a little bit on when I ride a bike, a road bike, and you know that generally almost every time I'm on my bike, there's going to be a car do something ridiculous, pass me really closely at 60 miles an hour, and my rage response is immediate, and I
Sure.
come out with lots of foul language, but
Mhm.
it's a sense of shock. I'm that close to
Mm.
death. Don't you get this? And it's like, so there's a sense of action. I've
Mhm.
got to do something about this, and I've got to also process this through my body. And that might just be in that moment by just moving out of my body that I am, you know, exercising that because I kind of don't want to hold on to that kind of energy.
Yeah, just on that actually, it reminds me that somebody was talking about they're in couples counselling, and it was a male-female partner coupling, and the man, because of anger, had been verbally abusive or often was,
Mm,
and the female therapist would not really say that the woman would say he said this, done this, and
mm,
the female therapist, not that it particularly matters whether she was female or not, but
mm,
would be saying, kind of ignoring the language and just talking about how hurt he must have felt and how difficult it must have been, and how much difficult it must have been for her to hear that. And
mm,
the person that was telling me, which was the woman, said it frustrated her that the therapist didn't at any point say that behavior does need to, it's unacceptable, it does need to change. You wouldn't talk to somebody at work like that. The reason I'm saying that is if somebody presumably comes in having experienced rage, has lashed out at people and says, look, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to be different, which I think is often going to be the case in my experience. But that would be people coming into therapy,
mm.
um, which I know it is the case with you. But so they'll be saying, look, it's not working for me. I do want it to be different. But I guess we all know and perhaps will have heard that place of anger, even rage, where somebody says, you made me do that. And you made me angry. So, and I just wonder how you manage that if you're with somebody who will take no responsibility at all and sort of sees it as other people's fault. I mean, it may not be your experience. Where
Mm.
people have feel safe enough, maybe they do tend to take a bit more responsibility for their behavior. But yeah, I just wondered what you say about that.
Yeah, I think one of my mantras around emotions is that no one can make me feel anything.
Mm-hmm.
So when we often use it, particularly around anger, he or she made me angry. And
Mm.
my response, well, no, that, you know, so I would say I'm fairly direct. If that comes out with that, I would be given my little mantra to say, you know, I don't think that's right because, and I've kind of, I give the example of, look, if I had 10 men or women in the room and I verbally abused each one of those people,
Mm.
I think, well, I know this, I would get 10 different responses
Mm-hmm.
and they wouldn't all be in anger.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that, so you're right in terms of if a person is unable to take responsibility for their behavior, and I often say, look, our growth is when we take responsibility for our emotions, our behavior, and our language.
Mm-hmm.
If we're unable to do that, we're not ready. we're not
Sure.
ready for therapy. We're not ready to kind of
Sure.
do the work ultimately, and
Mhm.
therefore it's very difficult to progress that work or that relational work.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I mean, just looking a bit more, touching again on kind of empathy and intimacy, saying some amazing things about that in terms of what you've seen.
Mm.
The importance of empathy, and I suppose its relationship with anger. Could you say something about that?
Well, yes. So, what do we know? What do we say about empathy? Well, empathy for me is about kind of trying to be in the other person's world as much as possible, to
Mhm.
try and kind of connect with them, to show that actually I get it, that this matters. So if anyone is talking about their pain or even their anger, I'm not there to judge. I'm not there to have a go at them, to tell them off. There may be some psychoeducation work in there, but so for me, when we are empathic, we are creating a really safe environment for people to be real. And
Mhm.
ultimately, if we want to work with these really difficult emotions, then for me, empathy is key.
Mhm.
Um, I to be able to provide that, not to kind of jump in or to question everything a person says, but to give them space, and safety to be able to talk about something that may feel quite shaming for them,
Mhm.
and they may feel quite vulnerable. I think that's why empathy is so important.
Mm. And I guess by experiencing it, by being on the receiving end, so to speak, it can connect that person with their own empathy, can't it? If they've been empathized with, and often I think men might be less empathized with in some ways during early experience. It's
Mm.
we're not going to be able to give something which we don't experience.
Mm.
Are there ways in which you would sort of develop exercises to develop empathy for them, or is it just by kind of modeling, so to speak, the
Yeah.
behavior?
Well, I think absolutely there is the modeling, isn't there? The
Mhm.
language that you may use as a therapist in that room. I'm going to try and be a model to men and to women and to couples in
Mhm.
that sense of what I'm trying to do. That yes, there are exercises. I think ultimately that, as we said, we're talking about mirroring, aren't we? We're
Mhm.
talking about in terms of being able, like I think empathy, what do we call it? Active listening,
Sure.
is really important in our lives and in our relationships. And so for me, I would want to be modeling and maybe giving them exercise and say, look, let's try and listen to another and stay in the other person's world. So I
Mhm.
often think when we talk about listening is that, which is very difficult, we may listen to someone else talking, and while they're talking, we are working out or formulating how we're going to respond, or if we're going to ask another question, or what we're going to say. Now, if we're doing that, we're not being empathic. To be
Mhm.
empathic is totally to listen to that person and to help them to know that we are listening to them, and that what they say matters to us. And our response may be maybe a follow-up question to what they've just said, but to nudge them to say, tell me more. So
Mhm.
for me, that's the active listening, is a big part of empathy. I think other exercises that if I was working with couples in particular, and I do this in groups, and I've done this with men's groups, is this is where we're kind of moving more into intimacy, I suppose. So there may be what I'd say to couples. It may be an exercise, what I call the 9 minute exercise, or it could be a 3 minute exercise, where basically it's 1 minute for one person to speak, the other person to listen
Mhm.
without saying anything ultimately, and then vice versa, and then a minute to feed back. It may be is called kind of soul gazing, holding each other's eye contact. So that
Mhm.
might be for a minute, 2 minutes. I've done this in groups, I've done this in therapeutic groups, and that's a very intimate exercise,
Yes,
and a
yes.
very vulnerable and exposing exercise. It might be, and again, as I've done in groups, might just be holding. I've done this with men in men's groups, just holding another man's hand for a
Mhm.
minute, and it might be massaging another man's hand for a
Mhm.
minute. So this is really kind of quite tender, intimate kind of work. Um, But again, when I do this, I invite men to do that, they do it. And there's
Okay. Well, I
fantastic.
was wondering, yeah, I mean, do
Yeah.
you get people object or say, look, there's no way I'm going to do that, or
Very rarely, actually. And I think I'm not saying I do this right straight away. This is what we're going to do.
sure.
So there's definitely a movement, but in terms of the 10-week anger group that I led, there was full of exercise all the way through. So we started off, and by the end, you were getting men in exercising their emotions and all their physicality in ways that most people think men don't do that, but they
Mhm.
were doing it in those sort of situations.
Fantastic. It sounds great.
Mm.
Because with men, do you think there are more obstacles to that kind of physical intimacy? When we had as well an initial conversation before this, I think you were saying also in the context of therapy that men with male therapists, perhaps it may come up that the kind of emotional intimacy perhaps isn't something that's necessarily been experienced, but it may also be something that somebody may have an aversion to in some ways. It could be something frightening or threatening.
Yes, I think it's really interesting. So I describe myself in terms of therapists as almost like an intimate stranger. So we're being real, a client can be really intimate with us. They can tell us things, and I often hear it, and as I'm sure you do, a client say, I've never told anybody that this in my life before. And I've heard that so many times from men. And for me, that's intimacy. That's incredible. That where a man might say those words, or they may cry, they may kind of be within their vulnerability. And that's a beautiful thing
Mm.
to experience and to be with. And you're right in thinking, well, when men work with male therapists, I think it can be really challenging because their experience generally,
Mm.
as a boy and as a young man or an adult man, is that men don't do that. We've learned actually banter, verbal banter, physical banter, and which is generally, I'm going to be negative towards you.
Yeah,
I've heard work with boys, day in, day out. You
yeah,
come to school and they put on their armor because they know they're
yeah,
going to be attacked verbally or
mm,
physically. And it's just so their vulnerability is
yeah,
wrapped up,
mm,
and so then to come and sit in front of with a male therapist, knowing that the socialization is, well, actually, if I share some of my vulnerability, this guy is just going to have a laugh at me. He's going to shame me. He's
mhm,
going to have banter.
mhm,
So being a male therapist, and being empathic, being okay with vulnerability, being okay with embracing uselessness is quite a strange phenomenon for many men.
yeah. Sorry,
So
did you say embracing uselessness?
yeah, yes, I did. So
Okay.
that's another term I use for empathy, I think, as a therapist, I think, because put it in this way. So I think most men have learned what I would call an action-centered empathy.
Mm,
So when there's a crisis, when there's a problem, men are, we've got the crisis services, don't we? We'll get in there. We'll sort it out. Fantastic, amazing. What
mm,
men are prepared to put themselves in danger. This is just a gift to humanity, that men are able to do that. And but however, and I'm not saying all men, I don't think I would put myself sometimes in those situations, but
sure.
but there's but what happens, I think, therefore in relational empathy, if their partner or their child um, wants to talk about a problem,
Mhm,
the immediate response for many men is, I'll give a solution. I'll fix it.
mhm,
Here you go. This is a problem. This is the fixer. Now, of course, many female adults, partners think, I don't need your solution. I'm an adult. I can work out the solution.
sure.
I want you to listen to me. And this is emotional centered empathy.
Mhm,
And I think for most men, and I've heard it many times, to be fair,
mm,
well, that's just useless, isn't it? What's the point of that? You want me just to listen? That's no
mm,
point. And so when we're talking about emotional centered empathy, I think we have to embrace uselessness. And I think for me as a therapist, I'm often in a space of, I feel quite useless. I
mhm,
don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. You know, when we hear these really shocking, awful stories, and we feel, such a weight as a therapist, and but we're sitting with it. We're trying to be
Mm.
empathic, and
Sure.
we're absorbing this stuff. And I do think I spend a lot of my time feeling useless, but
Mm.
that uselessness is quite magical,
Mm.
amazingly, to the client. I've heard so many men say, I don't know what you've done, but this is amazing.
Hmm.
And I would say what I've done is being empathic.
Sure.
Yeah.
And as you say, that when you say uselessness as well, that not knowing necessarily, because I think that can be difficult too if you're looking at professional environments to say, I don't know, or even kind of protective environments, I don't know. Those aren't responses that are going to work very well in those environments, are they? So we're sort of, as a lot of human beings are, particularly at work, maybe
Yeah.
conditioned into kind of being the expert and knowing.
Yeah.
So that place of I just don't know, and therefore sitting with the not knowing would be a big thing in therapy, wouldn't it? Is
Absolutely.
it can be very unfamiliar and feel threatening,
Mm.
I suppose.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
interesting what you say about banter. I don't know if you could just say a little bit more about that, only because I've recorded a video on it, actually, because for a few reasons. We were talking about anger. We've been talking about anger. I think it's Stephen King said humor is almost always anger with its makeup on. So that another way in which people can communicate anger, passive aggression, is through a certain type of humor. Actually, and it can be through something like banter. But I think it's so pervasive, isn't it? And actually so valued amongst particularly younger people that I do
Mm.
think it causes some real problems. It's probably always been around. Perhaps it's been
Mm.
named something now.
Yeah.
But as I say, I recorded a video on it about we all love humor. Humor's a wonderful thing and it's very connecting, isn't it? But
Mm.
I think banter can be used to put people down. It can be used to win, isn't it? Demean, diminish,
Yeah.
express anger. And somebody's left a bit powerless because
Mm.
it's a joke. It was funny.
Yeah.
You're being
Mm.
overly sensitive. I
Yeah.
think banter can play a big part actually in reducing people's capacity for vulnerability and intimacy.
No, absolutely. I can't add too much more about what you're saying about banter, but I think I've heard it said, if you say, and young people, it's only banter, mate.
Sure.
The idea, well, I've heard people in school tell me about there been racist, there's been, sexism, all sorts of stuff. It's only banter. So this
Mm,
idea, as you say, we're turning it into it's humor, mate. Got to laugh.
mm,
But what we're asking is we are going to laugh at your expense.
mm.
And that is bullying ultimately.
Sure.
And that, as you say, it's a aggressive anger that
Mm,
is absolutely unhealthy. Now, I
mm,
happen to really, as a person, man, older man, I love banter.
mm,
Now, I think in terms of if we're going to do banter, if we're going to kind of almost like you say, it's kind of having a little passive aggressive jibe at another, and having a laugh at another's expense. That's absolutely what it's about. Now, if
mm,
I use banter, and I want to check in with that person. Is
mm,
this okay with you?
mm,
Because I don't want you to feel hurt or undermined. Because so when there are people who don't do banter and that is unhelpful for them, if I'm with another person who may just have a laugh and in that way, I want to check in and to make sure that this is safe. And I think because often banter is about a hierarchy. There's
yeah.
someone who's doing something that's where it moves into bullying.
Sure.
Um,
Mm,
so if it's even and equal and it's not one person being in a group that everybody's attacking, then of course
mm,
all of that for me is unhelpful and negative.
yeah.
And that
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. I think if boys and men are brought up, or that's their normal environment of banter, then yeah, to step out, put your hand up and say, actually, that's not okay. I
Mm,
feel quite hurt, is a
mm,
huge thing to say. because there is the fear, of course, they'll just double down. Um,
Yeah.
and so it does reduce the possibility of vulnerability. But having said that, I'll just add this. I've been working with some men who we've been talking about this actually, adult men, and the way they are with their mates, and they're not satisfied with it.
Mm.
So there, we've been discussing about, well, maybe you could do this, or you could just drop this in. And this particular client has been trying this out, and is really eager to do this, and
Yeah.
just, and it's amazing. The most men respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's, it's a need and want. We talk about differences between men and women, but actually most people want to, to be easy to be loved and find it easy to love other people, isn't it? And a lot of the things we've been talking about are to facilitate that, or something like anger, it's just could potentially be an obstacle to it. So I think most people want the same thing, whoever they are, don't they? Whatever race, gender, whatever they'd identify. Oh, that sounds amazing. So things that they would try in relationships with other men, did you say,
Yeah,
with this client?
yeah,
Just out of
definitely.
interest, what sort of things would you suggest?
Well, I think it's dropping into asking, maybe a question. It may be, tell me, I don't know, tell me about, what's been going on for you this week. So
Yeah.
moving away from, or sharing something of themselves. Do you know, even the idea of, I just really want to tell you, I'm in counselling at the moment.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of men have been a lot more open about talking about that with
Yeah.
their mates, and then they hear, oh, yes, so am I, you know,
Mhm.
and or I had some recently as well.
Mm.
And so I think that idea of being able to drop in something a bit more serious, make yourself available, share something of your own life, can often lead other men to, because it's contagious, isn't it? That vulnerability is
Yeah,
contagious.
definitely. It creates the safety that allows other people to
Yeah.
do that, doesn't it? Which sounds amazing. Yes. Well, I
Right.
mean, we are about, running out of time. Just as sort of final reflections, I would often ask people sort of life lessons, most significant things they've learned through life. I know this is a big question to come at the end, but what would you say about that?
Oh, that, like you say, it is a big question. Most significant thing, well, I think, and I would say this is a life lesson which I'm still learning and probably diving into more. And this is particularly not just around men, but I think I've led a lot of my life being self-reliant. And I
Mm-hmm.
think this is about the sense of I will look after myself. I've learned to look after myself, trust myself. I don't need anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the sooner we can get to the sense of actually the truth is, I do need other people.
Mm-hmm.
I do need to learn to love and be loved.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that sense of I do need to be connected with other people. And I think for me, the older I get, I I want more connection. I
Mm-hmm.
want more loving. I
Yeah.
want more tenderness with men, with women,
Yeah.
that sense of I do need this. And I think that's
Yeah.
the thing. What do you need, man?
Yes.
And often, as I said, we go, I don't need anything. I'm now at the point, I think I need a lot. I need that tenderness
Well, and
and
also need it because it feels good, doesn't
yeah,
it? There is, it feels great. I remember somebody saying recently that relationships are life's best experiences. I mean, it will be connected relationships, won't it? But
mm,
that really is fundamentally what most people would say is their most important value is other people, isn't it? And
yeah,
so
yeah,
the better that those can work,
yeah,
the better it is for us. It feels good fundamentally.
absolutely.
That's the
No,
carrot, isn't
absolutely.
it?
Loads
Yeah.
of benefit. We get benefits from relating, connecting with other people. Absolutely.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, we are at the end, but thank you so much. That's been amazing. It's gone very quickly, actually, and so much that we've covered. I think
Right.
we could go on for ages, but we don't have the time. So thanks again. I really appreciate you coming on. It's been great,
Right.
and we'll be in touch. But
Brilliant.
you take care.
Thanks, John Paul. Lovely to be with you.
Okay.